Episode 613 of Better Call Saul was named Saul Gone, and was the final episode of the series, and likely the final piece of media from the Breaking Bad universe. We begin the episode right from where we left off in 612. With Saul fleeing Marion's house. He retrieves his diamonds, and gets ready to call the disappearer once more. With nowhere to go, he jumps into a dumpster, a likely callback to 108, RICO, where Jimmy is searching for the shredded Sandpiper documents in a dumpster. We could reasonably call this the first major plot point of the series, in terms of Jimmy's law career. It seems fitting therefore that he's now back in one before he gets caught. It's also somewhat of a visual callback to the first montage of season 6, with the Saul cutout being placed into the dumpster outside his house. His being in the dumpster also feels very fitting with his whole cockroach thing. There's lots of parallels between past and present in this episode, so I wanted to look at that today. In this video, I thought we'd discuss specifically the flashbacks of Saul Gone. One of the main things we see scattered throughout the episode are flashbacks. We get a series of flashbacks in this episode to conversations with Mike, Walt, and Chuck. Mike somewhere between the events of Bagman and Bad Choice Road, Walt during 505 of Breaking Bad, Granite State, in the disappearer's vacuum shop, then Chuck seemingly pre-season 1, or possibly the day before 101's main events. One thing I did notice though was that Jimmy did have his pinky ring, which would suggest it would have to take place somewhere after 110. He doesn't seem to have his office with Kim yet though, so I think we're somewhere from 110 to 208. Possibly some kind of continuity error though with the ring. I'm not too sure. It's odd because he has the ring, but he's still on good terms with Chuck, despite the fact that they have their big argument in 109, Pimento, and Jimmy receives the ring in 110. I'm rambling a bit, but I'm just trying to get a vague idea of where this scene is taking place. Anyway, the first conversation with Mike during their desert trek occurs after they find some water, which we never saw originally in Bagman or Bad Choice Road, nor do we hear it recounted to Lalo from Jimmy. I like the setup to this scene. The moment out in the desert, water is found, almost like a mirage, and the two of them settle down to rest, where Jimmy has just been on the brink of death, drinking his own pee. As soon as he gets water, and his survival appears more assured, he seems to instantly think back to the money, something that had fled his mind to a degree, due to the traumatic events that he had experienced. The scene between them is quite nice, it's quite sincere, maybe the most sincere we've seen the two of them being together, or so it initially seems. Just sitting, after a near-death experience, and discussing this question of what they would do with the time machine. First off though, Jimmy asks Mike why they don't just take the money and go. Split the $7 million of bail money that they're sitting on and just take it. A clear callback to their season 1 interaction that kicked off their professional relationship when Jimmy got Mike to steal the Kettleman's million and something in money, and Jimmy asks Mike why they didn't just run with it. 110 ends with Jimmy saying that when he has that amount of money in his possession again, he's never going to make the mistake of giving it up. It's good I think because it shows that despite this idea of Jimmy being incapable of change, he clearly is. His shallow mindset in season 1 of money is all that matters clearly isn't true here. If that were the case, he would just take the money. And further, it's an extra means to prove that this time machine answer is also quite phony and untrue to what he actually thinks. He's already preceded the time machine question with a question that he already knows the answer to. He has no intention of actually leaving with the money, so his answer of going back in the time machine to make lots of money, despite sitting on 7 million at his current moment, makes absolutely no sense, and clearly outlines how untruthful he is being to both Mike and himself. It's like an instant contradiction. The taking of the money is also somewhat of a callback to that Lalo and Kim scene, where Lalo admits there's a good chance that Saul would just go up and run with the money, Kim saying he'd never do that. An insight potentially to the fact that she is really the only one around who can see Jimmy's true intentions and desires. Alternately, Mike's perspective on the money question is the typical, it wasn't theirs. He had a job to do, and he did it. This is pretty much exactly the same words he says about the Kettleman's money also. It's really interesting having these same answers essentially, but with one character stating truly what they think, and the other both times lying or concealing what they really feel. Both times too after quite traumatic experiences. It reveals the idea of Jimmy's inability to change, which is really important to these flashbacks I think. The idea of him always being this way way, I think is more meant to be that he's always been incapable of really facing up to his emotions, and not so much that he's always been a scammer, for example. He's been raised with a wolf and sheep mentality, and when traumatic events hurt him, he recoils into Saul, resulting in these money-related answers that feel often quite jarring for someone like Jimmy. Despite testing the vulnerabilities of those around him with questions about regrets, he still doesn't feel comfortable to truly express his own regrets. I feel the point of this wasn't to show that Jimmy was cold-hearted and truly only cared about money, because if that were the case, he would have stood by his 110 sentiment of just taking it, or possibly he would have had Mike not been there. I think it was simply to show that he's just not telling the truth. On the surface level, on his Saul level, that's the guy that would grab the money and go, or follow the money like he did with Walt. Ultimately though, Jimmy isn't that guy. Both Mike and Jimmy somewhat parallel each other here too. Mike in his own way has his Saul persona. Jimmy uses Saul to cope with himself, to cope with his emotions. It's a very flashy coping mechanism, but that's largely because of who Jimmy is. Mike's own coping mechanism being this sense of justice, and the idea that he's different from the others in the game. So their answers mirroring their Season 1 answers, I think is to just show that the both of them are somewhat in emotional limbo. Two people who could understand each other on a deeper level, but decide to instead provide shallow answers that help neither of them. A big thing in Better Call Saul is people not talking to each other, and stuffing their true feelings down. These flashbacks each have a connection, I think, of both of the characters failing to be truly honest with one another, whether that happens on one side or both sides. For the time machine question, Mike's answer is a fairly straightforward one. He first quotes the date of December 8th, 2001, which I believe is the day Matty died, or possibly the day Mike convinced Matty to take his first bribe. It could also quite possibly be the day that he killed the two cops. Mike then revises his answer to March 17th, 1984, being the day he took his first bribe. This feels pretty in line with what we know of Mike, and where he sees the source of his problems. I do like his adjustment of answer though, his initial answer being fairly straightforward and possibly shallow in itself. Only upon reflection does he realise, wait no, the problem started with me, revising his answer. It's further revealing as it shows that deep down Mike does want to be seen as a man of justice. Despite his attempts to have that justice encode in the criminal world, he can never truly say he is a just person. Therefore, the source of his problems is ultimately his decision to switch sides, to break bad. He seems to deem this decision as his first that led him down the bad choice road, that quote originally coming from him. This answer seems to be quite an honest one. Unfortunately though, this doesn't extend to Jimmy's own answer, and even by his reaction, I don't think Jimmy expected such an honest answer, particularly with his initial predictions of going back to ancient Rome and stuff like that. It shows just how out of touch he is with his emotions, where he's currently at. Just a few seasons after Chuck's death, he's still clearly very vulnerable and he's pushing further and further into Saul. Alternately to Mike, Jimmy gives the answer of May 10th, 1965, the day Warren Buffett took over Berkshire Hathaway, so that he could become a billionaire, this being the 2003 equivalent of going back and investing in Bitcoin or something. It's your typical, obvious, but very shallow answer of, well, if I could go back, I would become extremely rich. It's blatantly obvious that Jimmy is not being truthful. At this point in the series, Jimmy is still very much repressing his emotions surrounding the death of his brother. My interpretation was that Jimmy's greatest regret was that he would go back and change his relationship with his brother. Maybe more literally, he would have decided to not get his insurance raised. But I think his brother was his true regret. This extending maybe even before Season 1. I do think this was made fairly clear throughout the series too, with Chuck's death really pushing the rest of the series, and forcing Jimmy into Saul. One of the clearest transitional moments for Jimmy as a character is in 401, when Jimmy goes to Chuck's burned down house. After that point, it was clear, I thought, that he was a different person in a sense, with it all really coming to fruition in 410, Winner. So why doesn't he answer honestly despite Mike's attempts to do so? I think it's somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that he feels bad about his relationship with Chuck, but equally, he can't let Chuck be right about him, which just pushes him further into Chuck being right. Jimmy's own regret is also far more nuanced really. Mike outlines he could have changed things had he just not taken the bribe. Jimmy's relationship with Chuck can't really be boiled down to one action, or even fully be blamed on him. Next we have his conversation with Walt, occurring at the disappearer's shop. This scene has quite a different tone, with Walt taking Jimmy's question in a very angry manner, mocking the idea of a time machine being possible, and boiling the question down to being about regrets, and less so about actual time travel. I do like though that he does have the exact thing to cite when talking about why it's not possible. It kind of suggests that maybe he has thought about it himself before, but doesn't exactly want to admit it. For his answer, Walt cites his selling of his grey matter shares for $5,000, which later turns into billions in the coming years. It's actually a fairly similar answer to Jimmy's own idea of going back and investing in Berkshire Hathaway. In any regard, the concept of going back and having not sold something that later became profitable is kind of just an obvious thing. It's a little different for Walt because he did partly found the company. However, the extent to which he expresses his involvement in the research and the importance of the company's success seems far more inflated each time he tells it. He also adds additional blame to Gretchen and Elliot. I quite like this because it outlines that despite Walt feeling so superior over Saul and talking down to him, he still provides a similar shallow answer to that of Saul. He doesn't say he would go back and not cook meth, taking Gretchen and Elliot up on their job offer. He wishes specifically to go back and not sell his grey matter shares. I think this is particularly interesting because only when he left grey matter did Walt settle down with Skylar and have his son, his family. It shows that his preference lies in having achieved something that he perceives to have value, which to him is something that is monetarily successful. I think it actually makes Jimmy's answer to Mike seem comparably more thoughtful than Walt's answer, despite Jimmy's being quite intentionally shallow. It's another clear moment that all along, Walt really just cared about himself. I think this scene really wants to outline that Jimmy isn't like that. Walt's being honest here, I think, too. Unlike Jimmy's clearly dishonest answer that he gave to Mike. Jimmy's answer to Walt, on the other hand, has him cite a different thing to his answer to Mike. This time around he says he would have gone back to when he was 22 and did his first slip and fall, a similar scam we see in 101 with the skaters. This almost aligning to how Mike previously answered, going back to his first time Breaking Bad and changing that. He's so nearly there with this said regret, and seems to have almost learned from what Mike said, until he mentions that he would go back to this so that he wouldn't have bad knees, not because it set him down a bad path. It seems initially that he may be going back to that moment, almost as if going back to the first scam he did and changing his ways, but instead it's just another fairly shallow comment about permanently injuring his knee. It's equally clear though that Jimmy is slowly pushing through. I kind of like that his bad knee almost represents this need within Jimmy, the idea that he injured himself as a result of doing a slip and fall. His scamming is like this permanent infliction upon him. Walt responds to this by saying, "So you were always like this," an ironic statement coming from him. I think it's also important though, because despite Jimmy doing things like slips and falls, that's not something he regrets, I don't think. Which is why his answer about this is also dishonest. I don't think Jimmy regretted that part of him. I do think he let that part take over, but I don't think it's anything he truly regretted necessarily, with some of his best years being with Kim, and also his days with Marco. It wasn't this thing he regretted, it was more that Chuck only ever believed Jimmy was capable of being that way. And to an extent, this is how the wider world viewed him too, with Walt expressing the same here. The final flashback we see is with Chuck, which happened somewhere in the early days of the show, when Jimmy was still bringing Chuck his supplies. We discover that the Time Machine book, also featured in the 601 opening, was originally Chuck's. I feel this is simply further evidence that Chuck is Jimmy's greatest regret. I thought it may even be possible that the book was one of the things he retrieved from Chuck's burnt down house. Maybe a bit of a stretch based on the damage we saw though. It also goes to show that Chuck, despite being a very logical person, who much like Walt, may not ever truly support the idea or concept of a time machine, is reading the book. A sign that he too believes he should have approached his relationship with Jimmy differently. He too wishes he could wind back time and fix things with his brother. The specific encounter that sums up their relationship is Chuck saying to Jimmy, "If you don't like where you're going, you can change your path." To which Jimmy replies, "When have you ever changed your path?" It pretty much sums up their entire relationship. Chuck always believing Jimmy is incapable of of truly changing, and Jimmy believing Chuck is incapable of changing how he views Jimmy. They are both equally stubborn in their perspective of one another, this being perfectly displayed in the first 3 seasons of the show. It's this perpetual loop they were stuck in, that they never quite got out of, but both clearly regretted ever being in. The worst part being that they always refused to really talk about it or solve it, because of what they both assumed about one another. The possession of the Time Machine book shows that Jimmy was very much on the same page as Chuck in regards to how they wish their relationship could have been. There was desire from both sides. The tragedy being that one of the main things that connected these two brothers is their desire to correct their relationship, which is something they never achieved. His regret being Chuck seems to come full circle when he confesses to the court in the current timeline, mentioning how he got Chuck's rates raised. It's a moment that doesn't really have any repercussions. It's more just about him getting it off his chest and finally admitting he's done it, in part for himself, but also to prove to Kim that he had returned to that person she knew. It was a moment of catharsis, something that had been sitting on his chest for years, and he finally expressed his responsibility for it. His confession here, I think, does prove that his regret is Chuck mainly. Potentially as a secondary regret would be the fact that he was never quite as open as he could have been with Kim. It was particularly noticeable during season 4, when the two of them were growing apart, and never really faced the emotions they each were feeling. Again, lack of talking is a big thing in this show. Let me know how you read these different flashbacks, and what you took away from each or all of them, as I'm sure there's plenty of other ways to understand these scenes that I haven't discussed here. Thanks for watching.